Hey guys, tonight we're heading to ancient Egypt to witness the final days of Cleopatra, a queen who spent years outsmarting rivals and convincing powerful Roman politicians to make increasingly questionable life choices. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the summer of 30 BC, Alexandria was beginning to realize that it might have backed the wrong side. This was not an entirely unfamiliar experience in ancient politics. Kingdoms, cities, and ambitious rulers regularly attached themselves to powerful allies who later exploded spectacularly, usually metaphorically, occasionally not. For years, Alexandria had stood at the center of one of the richest and most impressive kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Ships crowded its harbors, merchants filled its streets, scholars wandered through its intellectual circles debating philosophy, mathematics, and other subjects that guaranteed nobody at a tavern would invite them to sit at their table. The city possessed wealth, prestige, and the famous Queen Cleopatra. What it did not possess was a solution to the Roman problem. His name was Octavian. Far to the west, Rome had spent years enthusiastically dismantling itself through civil war. Generals fought generals. Senators betrayed senators. Political alliances lasted approximately as long as fresh bread. Every few months, someone declared themselves the savior of the Republic while helping destroy it. Cleopatra had chosen to support Mark Antony, one of Rome's most famous commanders. At the time, this seemed perfectly reasonable. Antony was wealthy, influential, charismatic, and controlled enormous territories. He was also 6 feet tall, successful in battle, and generally looked like the sort of man history expected to win. Octavian, by comparison, appeared less impressive. He was often sick. He lacked Antony's military reputation. He possessed none of Antony's larger-than-life personality. What Octavian did possess, however, was the irritating habit of defeating everyone who underestimated him. History is full of people who looked unbeatable right before discovering they were not. 2 years earlier, the naval battle of Actium had changed everything. The defeat shattered Antony and Cleopatra's position. Now Octavian's armies were marching steadily toward Egypt, and unlike rumours, taxes, and royal promises, Roman legions had a tendency to arrive exactly where they said they would. Across Alexandria, anxiety spread. Merchants whispered in markets. Servants exchanged gossip in palace corridors. Sailors arriving in port brought fresh rumours every day. Some claimed Antony was preparing a brilliant comeback. Others insisted Cleopatra had secret allies ready to rescue Egypt. A few citizens quietly began practicing the ancient survival skill of pretending they had supported Octavian all along. Inside the royal palace, Cleopatra faced the greatest crisis of her life. She had survived family betrayals, assassination attempts, rebellions, civil wars, and several relatives who viewed murder as a perfectly acceptable method of succession planning. Compared to the average Ptolemaic family gathering, a nest of cobras was considered a relaxing environment. She was intelligent, experienced, and remarkably resilient. But even Cleopatra could see reality approaching. The Roman world was about to have a new master, and unless a miracle occurred, Egypt's last queen would soon have to meet him. What nobody realized was that the final chapter of Cleopatra's reign would not unfold like a grand tragedy. It would unfold like a comedy of errors involving rumors, misunderstandings, panicked decisions, and communication failures so spectacular that future historians would spend 2,000 years trying to make everyone involved sound more competent than they actually were. As anxiety spread through Alexandria, Cleopatra began preparing for the possibility that things might not end particularly well. This was not pessimism, it was experience. After all, she had spent most of her life navigating assassination attempts, palace conspiracies, Roman politics, and relatives. Of those four dangers, the relatives were arguably the most unpredictable. While many rulers in her position might have focused exclusively on military plans, Cleopatra decided to prepare something else. A tomb. Not just any tomb. A gigantic mausoleum filled with treasure. Ancient sources describe a massive structure built near her palace, stocked with gold, silver, jewels, valuable documents, and enough wealth to make even the most disciplined Roman official suddenly become interested in accounting. Officially, it was intended to be her final resting place. Unofficially, it was also a very expensive bargaining chip. The Queen understood Octavian perfectly. He wanted two things. First, he wanted Cleopatra alive. Second, he wanted Cleopatra's treasure. Ideally, he wanted both. This created a problem for him and an opportunity for her. If she could not save her kingdom, she might still influence the outcome. So treasure began disappearing from the palace and reappearing inside the mausoleum. Gold moved, silver moved, jewels moved, more gold moved, then probably some additional gold just to be safe. Watching the operation must have been fascinating. Imagine being a palace servant and noticing that every valuable object in Egypt seemed to be heading toward one very specific building. At some point, people probably stopped asking questions. The mausoleum quickly became less of a tomb and more of a heavily fortified royal vault. Cleopatra reportedly threatened to destroy the treasure if Octavian tried to seize it. This was not an idle threat. If she burned or ruined those riches, Octavian would lose one of the greatest prizes of his entire campaign. Conquering Egypt was impressive. Conquering Egypt and finding the treasury reduced to ashes was considerably less impressive. The situation was becoming almost comical. Octavian needed Cleopatra alive. Cleopatra knew he needed her alive. Octavian wanted the treasure. Cleopatra knew he wanted the treasure. Both sides were now engaged in a high-stakes contest involving an empire, a kingdom, and a building that was slowly becoming the ancient equivalent of a panic room. The strangest part was that this was only the beginning, because very soon Cleopatra would lock herself inside that mausoleum, and a misunderstanding born from that decision would trigger one of the most famous and absurd chain reactions in ancient history. As Octavian's armies moved closer to Alexandria, Cleopatra's carefully constructed plans began entering their next phase. And almost immediately, everything became unnecessarily complicated. The Queen decided to withdraw into her mausoleum. This was understandable. The building contained her treasure, her supplies, and perhaps the last remaining leverage she possessed. If events turned ugly, she wanted to be near the one thing Octavian desired almost as much as her capture. So Cleopatra entered the mausoleum with a small group of trusted attendants. Then she had the doors sealed. From her perspective, this was a reasonable precaution. From everyone else's perspective, it looked alarmingly similar to a funeral. Ancient communication systems were not particularly efficient. There were no phones, no emails, no group messages, no way to instantly tell everyone, "Don't worry, I'm alive," just hiding in my giant treasure-filled tomb. Instead, information travelled through servants, guards, messengers, rumours, assumptions, and occasionally that one person who confidently explained situations while understanding absolutely none of them. Before long, stories began spreading through Alexandria. Someone heard that Cleopatra had sealed herself inside. Someone else heard she would never come out. Another person misunderstood the entire conversation. By the end of the day, many people were repeating a dramatic new version. The Queen was dead. Nobody seems entirely sure how this rumour evolved so quickly. Perhaps someone guessed, perhaps someone exaggerated, perhaps someone simply enjoyed being the first person to share shocking news. Humanity has never completely solved that particular problem. Eventually, the story reached Mark Antony. This was unfortunate, because Antony was not having a good week. His military position had collapsed. Many of his supporters had abandoned him. His armies were shrinking. His enemies were multiplying. And now he received word that Cleopatra had died. Modern historians often try to imagine what Antony was thinking in that moment. The answer was probably something very simple. Of course she has. When a person's life is already falling apart, bad news tends to feel strangely believable. Instead of investigating further, Antony accepted the report. No messenger was sent to confirm it. No witness was questioned. No second opinion was requested. One of the greatest commanders in Roman history essentially heard a rumour and immediately treated it as established fact. The consequences would be extraordinary. Within hours, a misunderstanding that began with a locked door would help trigger one of the most famous deaths in ancient history. And somewhere inside her mausoleum, Cleopatra had absolutely no idea what was happening outside, which, ironically, made her the calmest person involved in the entire situation. The rumour had reached Mark Antony. Unfortunately, so had despair. By this point, Antony's world was collapsing with impressive efficiency. His fleet had been defeated. His allies were abandoning him. His soldiers were defecting to Octavian. Even worse, some of them were defecting enthusiastically, which is never encouraging. For years, Antony had been one of the most powerful men in the Roman world. He had commanded armies, governed provinces, and helped decide the fate of entire nations. Now he found himself in Alexandria, surrounded by bad news and increasingly fewer people willing to tell him otherwise. Then came the report. Cleopatra was dead. The queen he loved, the ruler he had built his future around. Gone, at least according to someone who had heard it from someone who had heard it from someone else. Normally, a person might verify such information. Antony chose a different approach. Ancient historians suggest he accepted the story almost immediately. Perhaps he was exhausted. Perhaps he was heartbroken. Perhaps he simply reached the point where every new disaster felt completely believable. After all, if your week already includes military collapse and political ruin, hearing that your partner has died probably doesn't sound particularly unrealistic. So Antony made a decision. He would take his own life. History often presents this moment with great drama. Paintings show heroic poses. Films add emotional speeches. Everything looks very dignified. Reality appears to have been considerably messier. According to ancient accounts, Antony ordered one of his servants to help him carry out the act. The servant, apparently deciding he had reached his limit for strange workplace requests, killed himself instead. This was not the intended outcome. Antony now faced the awkward situation of watching his assistant complete a task meant for someone else. The day was somehow becoming worse. Eventually, Antony wounded himself. But unlike the elegant versions found in paintings, the attempt did not immediately kill him. Instead, he remained alive. Very much alive. Painfully alive. And while he was dealing with this unfortunate development, another piece of information arrived. Cleopatra was not dead. She had never been dead. she was safely inside her mausoleum. At this point, Antony must have experienced one of the most frustrating realizations in ancient history. The entire tragedy had been triggered by a rumor that was completely wrong. Somewhere in Alexandria, a messenger was probably reconsidering his career choices. What followed next was even stranger, because Antony, wounded but still alive, now wanted to see Cleopatra one final time. There was only one problem. She had locked herself inside a fortified mausoleum, and she wasn't opening the door. As a result, one of Rome's greatest generals was about to be hauled through a window using ropes like an unusually heavy sack of grain. Mark Antony was dying. Cleopatra was alive. And unfortunately, there was now a very large building standing between them. The Queen remained inside her mausoleum, which she had deliberately sealed shut. This decision made perfect sense from a security perspective. It made considerably less sense from the perspective of receiving wounded Roman generals. Antony's supporters carried him to the mausoleum and called out to those inside. The response they received was not an invitation to enter. Cleopatra had become deeply suspicious of everyone and everything. Given the circumstances, this was probably reasonable. Octavian's soldiers were nearby. The city was falling apart. Rumours were spreading faster than facts. Opening the door might expose her to danger, so the door stayed shut. This created a logistical problem. Antony was outside. Cleopatra was inside, and neither wanted the meeting cancelled. The solution they devised sounds less like history and more like a group project that nobody properly planned. Instead of opening the entrance, Cleopatra ordered ropes to be lowered from an upper window. The goal was simple: lift Antony into the mausoleum. The execution was somewhat more complicated. Antony was many things: a celebrated general, a politician, a veteran soldier, a former master of Rome's eastern territories. What he was not was lightweight. Roman commanders were not exactly known for skipping meals. Ancient writers describe Cleopatra and her attendants pulling desperately on the ropes, while Antony was slowly raised toward the window. Imagine the scene: one of the most famous men in the Mediterranean dangling in mid-air. Several exhausted women struggling to pull him upward. Servants shouting instructions. Everyone trying not to drop the future subject of countless statues. The entire Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Its final chapter now involved an emergency pulley system. History can be wonderfully disrespectful. The effort was enormous. Ancient accounts specifically mention how difficult the task was. Cleopatra herself reportedly helped pull the ropes. The Queen, who had charmed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, negotiated with kings, and ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, was now engaged in what amounted to a very stressful hauling operation. Eventually, Antony made it inside. Barely. The reunion was emotional. The couple spent Antony's final moments together while Alexandria continued collapsing around them. Outside, Octavian's victory was becoming inevitable. Inside, Cleopatra watched the last of her great political alliance disappear. Yet even here, the strange comedy of events continued. Antony had not fallen in battle. He had not been captured by enemies. He had not died during some heroic final charge. Instead, one of history's greatest generals spent his last hours recovering from a fatal misunderstanding and being pulled through a window because nobody wanted to unlock a door. If the Roman historians found that slightly embarrassing, they had good reason. Unfortunately for Cleopatra, Antony's death solved none of her problems. In fact, her situation was about to become even more dangerous. Now she had to deal directly with Octavian. With Mark Antony dead, Cleopatra's position became painfully simple. She was alone. Not literally, of course. Servants, attendants, and advisors still surrounded her. But politically, She stood alone. The alliance that had protected Egypt for years had vanished. Octavian had won. The Roman world now belonged to him. The only remaining question was what he planned to do with Cleopatra. Fortunately for her, Octavian did not want her dead. Unfortunately for her, he wanted something arguably worse. He wanted her alive. This may sound encouraging at first. It was not. In Rome, victorious generals celebrated their achievements with triumphs, enormous public processions through the city. Captured kings, princes, and rulers were paraded before cheering crowds. The audience laughed, the prisoners suffered, the general received glory. Everyone understood their role. Cleopatra knew exactly what would happen if she was taken to Rome. She would become the centerpiece of Octavian's greatest victory parade. For a queen who had spent her entire life presenting herself as the living embodiment of royal dignity, this was an unbearable prospect. Being killed by an enemy was one thing, being displayed by an enemy was another. Meanwhile, Octavian was being surprisingly careful. Many conquerors might have rushed directly into the mausoleum. Octavian preferred patience. He understood Cleopatra's value. Dead, she was a symbol. Alive, she was propaganda. And Octavian appreciated good propaganda almost as much as he appreciated winning. Messengers began travelling back and forth. Promises were made. Warnings were delivered. Negotiations started. Each side attempted to gain an advantage. Each side distrusted the other completely. The conversations must have been exhausting. Imagine two highly intelligent leaders discussing cooperation while simultaneously assuming every sentence contains a hidden trap. That was essentially the atmosphere. Cleopatra tried to discover Octavian's intentions. Octavian tried to discover Cleopatra's plans. Neither revealed very much. At the same time, another issue continued to dominate everyone's thoughts. The treasure. The enormous collection of wealth stored inside the mausoleum. Gold, silver, jewels, precious objects accumulated over centuries. Octavian wanted it, very badly. Conquering Egypt was already a historic achievement. Conquering Egypt while also acquiring its treasury was even better. In many ways, Cleopatra herself and her treasure had become linked together. Whoever controlled one would probably gain the other. The queen understood this perfectly, which meant she still possessed one final source of leverage. As long as she remained alive and the treasure remained inaccessible, Octavian could not fully relax. For perhaps the last time in her life, Cleopatra still had cards left to play. The problem was that Octavian was holding most of the deck, and with every passing day, the queen was running out of moves. As the days passed, Cleopatra found herself confronting a problem she had spent most of her life avoiding. She was running out of options. This was a deeply unfamiliar experience. For nearly 2 decades, Cleopatra had solved impossible situations through intelligence, negotiation, charisma, political maneuvering, or occasionally by convincing powerful Roman men that helping her was somehow their own brilliant idea. The strategy had worked remarkably well. Until now. Octavian controlled Egypt. His armies occupied Alexandria. His victory was complete. And yet Cleopatra refused to surrender to despair. If there was one thing she never lacked, it was determination. Ancient sources suggest she explored every possibility she could imagine. Could she negotiate with Octavian? Perhaps. Could she secure a favourable arrangement for her children? Maybe. Could she somehow escape Egypt entirely? The answer was becoming increasingly doubtful. One story claims Cleopatra considered transporting ships overland to the Red Sea, where she could flee eastward and establish a new base of power. The plan sounds impressive. It also sounds like the kind of idea people develop, when every normal option has already failed? Moving ships across a desert is technically possible. It is simply an enormous amount of work for people already experiencing several larger problems. The plan never materialized. Another possibility involved diplomacy. Cleopatra understood that Octavian was ambitious. Ambitious people could sometimes be negotiated with. The difficulty was that Octavian had already won. Negotiations are easier when both sides need something. At this point, Cleopatra needed Octavian far more than Octavian needed Cleopatra. That imbalance was impossible to ignore. Still, she continued trying. Messages moved back and forth. Offers were considered. Promises were hinted at. Neither side fully trusted the other. Both sides were correct. The Queen also focused intensely on her children. This may have been her greatest concern. Kingdoms rise and fall. Treasures can be replaced. But children remain children, even when their parents happen to be fighting for control of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra desperately wanted to secure their future. Unfortunately, Roman civil wars were not known for producing generous outcomes for the families of defeated rivals. As every possible solution collapsed, reality became harder to avoid. The walls were closing in. The Queen, who had once stood beside Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, now found herself trapped inside a shrinking circle of possibilities. Yet, remarkably, ancient accounts describe her remaining calm, not cheerful, not optimistic, but composed. It was an impressive achievement. Most people become stressed when they receive an unexpected bill. Cleopatra was dealing with the destruction of a dynasty 3 centuries old, and somehow she still managed to think clearly. For the moment, at least. Because soon she would begin considering a question that no ruler wants to ask. If defeat is unavoidable, how exactly should one face it? By now, Cleopatra understood something that nobody around her wanted to say out loud. The game was over. Not immediately, not officially, but practically. Octavian controlled Egypt. His soldiers controlled Alexandria. His spies seemed to know everything. And every escape plan Cleopatra considered somehow ended with Roman soldiers waiting at the destination. It was becoming increasingly difficult to remain optimistic. Yet Cleopatra was not the sort of person who simply sat around feeling sorry for herself. She approached problems methodically. Even extremely unpleasant problems. Especially extremely unpleasant problems. According to several ancient writers, Cleopatra began investigating various poisons and methods of death. This sounds grim. And it was. But there was also something oddly practical about it. Most rulers in history spent their final days praying for miracles. Cleopatra apparently started researching alternatives. The Queen wanted to know which methods caused pain, which worked quickly, which worked slowly, which produced visible suffering, and which did not. In essence, she was conducting what may have been history's least cheerful research project. Ancient sources claim that prisoners condemned to death were sometimes used to observe the effects of various poisons. Whether every detail is true remains uncertain. Ancient historians occasionally treated rumours the way fishermen treat the size of their catches. Stories tended to grow. Nevertheless, most accounts agree that Cleopatra carefully examined her options. The famous aspi, the venomous snake forever associated with her death, appears in these discussions. According to later stories, she became convinced that its bite offered a relatively peaceful end. Whether that was scientifically accurate is another question entirely. Ancient medicine was not always famous for rigorous testing standards. Many treatments involved ingredients that modern doctors would classify as alarming. While Cleopatra worried about her future, Octavian worried about something else. The treasure. Lots and lots of treasure. It may not sound particularly noble, but history has always been refreshingly honest about one thing. Conquering a kingdom is nice, but conquering a kingdom that comes with several warehouses full of gold is even nicer. Egypt was one of the wealthiest regions in the Mediterranean. Its grain-fed cities, its ports connected continents. Its treasury had accumulated generations of royal wealth, and much of that wealth now sat inside Cleopatra's mausoleum. The Queen knew it, Octavian knew it, everyone involved knew it. At this point, the treasure had become almost another character in the story. Ancient sources report that Cleopatra threatened to destroy the riches if she felt cornered. This was not a threat Octavian could afford to ignore. He wanted Egypt intact. He wanted its wealth intact. Most importantly, he wanted to return to Rome looking like the greatest victor in Roman history. A burned treasury would complicate that image considerably. Imagine spending years winning a civil war, only to discover that your prize had been converted into a giant bonfire. Even Roman propaganda would struggle with that. As a result, Octavian found himself in a surprisingly delicate position. He could not push Cleopatra too hard. He could not completely trust her, and he definitely could not leave her unsupervised. The Queen remained under close watch. Guards monitored visitors, messengers were scrutinized. Every movement attracted attention. The Romans were essentially treating Cleopatra like the world's most valuable prisoner, which, to be fair, she probably was. Yet despite these precautions, Octavian remained uneasy. Cleopatra seemed too calm. Most defeated rulers displayed obvious signs of despair. They begged, they panicked, they made increasingly unrealistic plans. Cleopatra was doing none of those things. Instead, she appeared thoughtful, composed, almost as if she had already accepted something. This made Octavian nervous. For all his victories, he understood one important fact. A person with nothing left to lose can become difficult to predict, and Cleopatra was among the most intelligent people he had ever encountered. The Roman leader began receiving reports from his guards. The Queen was writing letters, speaking privately with attendants, making arrangements. Nothing seemed suspicious individually. Together, however, they created a troubling pattern. It felt as though Cleopatra was preparing for something. The problem was that nobody knew exactly what. And while Octavian tried to secure Egypt's future, Cleopatra was quietly securing control over the only thing she still possessed completely: her own fate. The contest between them was entering its final stage. One wanted a living queen. The other intended to remain queen until the very end. For most of her life, Cleopatra had been the person making plans. If one strategy failed, she created another. If an ally disappeared, she found a replacement. If an enemy emerged, she looked for a weakness. She had survived in a political environment where mistakes were often rewarded with poison, exile, or a surprisingly short reign. Yet now, for perhaps the first time in years, she could see the board clearly. And there were no good moves left. Octavian controlled Egypt. His soldiers guarded Alexandria. His agents watched her constantly. The Mediterranean belonged to Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great's successors, was effectively finished. 3 centuries of history had narrowed down to a handful of rooms and a few remaining decisions. Oddly enough, this seems to have made Cleopatra calmer. Ancient writers repeatedly comment on her composure during these final days. Not cheerful composure, not optimistic composure. The kind of calm that appears when a person stops worrying about outcomes they can no longer change. Meanwhile, Octavian was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. This sounds strange. After all, he had won. His rival Antony was dead. Egypt was conquered. The civil war was over. He was only months away from becoming the undisputed master of the Roman world. This should have been a relaxing time. Instead, he found himself worrying about a single woman. The problem was simple. Cleopatra was too intelligent. Every report from his guards seemed slightly suspicious. The Queen requested certain foods. Why? The Queen met privately with attendants. Why? The Queen wrote letters. To whom? The Queen spent long periods in reflection. What was she planning? The Romans searched for clues everywhere. At times they resembled nervous parents trying to figure out what a particularly clever teenager was doing. The more closely they watched, the less confident they became. Cleopatra, meanwhile, continued arranging her affairs. She spoke about her children. She settled practical matters. She prepared for possibilities that nobody wished to discuss openly. One of her final requests was reportedly to visit Antony's tomb. Octavian allowed it. Perhaps he believed it would comfort her. Perhaps he thought cooperation would make her easier to manage. Whatever his reasoning, the visit occurred. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra wept at Antony's burial place and spoke to him one last time. It was a deeply human moment amid a story dominated by politics and war. Yet, even after that farewell, Octavian still failed to understand what was happening. He believed time was working in his favour. He thought Cleopatra would eventually accept reality. What he didn't realise was that Cleopatra had already accepted reality. That was precisely the problem. Because once she accepted it, she became free to make her final decision. And when that decision arrived, it would catch Octavian completely off guard. On the morning of her final day, Cleopatra appeared remarkably ordinary. This was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. There were no dramatic speeches delivered from palace balconies, no desperate attempts to rally armies, no last-minute plots to overthrow Octavian. The Queen simply went about her business, which, in hindsight, should have worried everyone much more than it did. Ancient sources suggest Cleopatra bathed, dressed carefully, and shared a meal. Nothing about her behaviour appeared unusual. To Roman guards watching nearby, this was encouraging. To modern readers, it feels suspiciously like the behaviour of someone who has already made up her mind. The problem for Octavian was that he still believed he had time. For weeks, he had been managing Cleopatra as though she were a difficult political problem. What he failed to understand was that Cleopatra no longer viewed herself as a political problem. She viewed herself as the person making the final decision. And those are two very different situations. At some point during the day, Cleopatra sent a letter to Octavian. The contents were brief. She reportedly requested to be buried beside Mark Antony. That was all. No negotiations, no demands, no discussion. Just a burial request. To most people, this would have been an emotional farewell. To a suspicious Roman official, it should have sounded like an alarm bell the size of Alexandria. Unfortunately, nobody reacted quickly enough. The letter reached Octavian. He read it, and suddenly realised something was very wrong. Extremely wrong. The kind of wrong that causes powerful men to leap out of chairs and start shouting orders. Messengers were dispatched immediately. Guards rushed toward Cleopatra's residence. Everyone suddenly moved with impressive speed. The problem was that they were moving with impressive speed several hours too late. When Roman officials finally reached the Queen, they discovered that Cleopatra had already acted. The exact details remain one of history's great mysteries. Ancient writers disagreed almost immediately. Some insisted an asp had been smuggled into her chambers, hidden among figs. Others argued poison was concealed in a hairpin. Some claimed a snake was involved. Others suspected something far less dramatic. Ancient historians were often united in one thing: their inability to agree with each other. What is certain is that Cleopatra succeeded. The queen had slipped beyond Octavian's control, and that was the true surprise. Not the method, not the mystery, not even the timing. The surprise was that after conquering Egypt, defeating Antony, and winning the Roman world, Octavian had still lost the one thing he wanted most: his living trophy. The woman he planned to display before Rome had quietly removed herself from the script. And somewhere in the palace, one can almost imagine a Roman officer realizing that the most closely watched woman in the Mediterranean had somehow beaten all of them one final time. The future emperor was about to discover that victory and satisfaction are not always the same thing. When Octavian received Cleopatra's letter, he immediately understood the situation. The request itself was simple. She wished to be buried beside Mark Antony. Nothing more. No negotiations. No pleas for mercy. No desperate attempt to save herself. Just a burial request. To an experienced politician, this was roughly equivalent to receiving a message that said, "By the way, I have already solved my own problem." Octavian reacted instantly. Orders were shouted. Messengers ran. Guards rushed toward Cleopatra's chambers. The future ruler of Rome suddenly displayed the speed and urgency of a man realizing that months of careful planning might be about to collapse. Unfortunately, he was correct. When Roman officials arrived, it was already over. Cleopatra was beyond their reach. For a few moments, the conquerors of Egypt simply stood there looking at the outcome. This was not supposed to happen. Octavian had planned everything carefully. He had defeated Antony. He had secured Alexandria. He had captured Egypt. He had protected the treasury. He had neutralized every major threat. The plan was working perfectly, except for one tiny detail. The most important prisoner had escaped, not physically, strategically, and somehow that was even more frustrating. The irony was almost painful. After years of warfare, thousands of casualties, and the complete reorganization of the Roman world, the future emperor found himself outmaneuvered by a woman he had already defeated. Technically, he still won. History would remember him as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. His victory was complete. But victories have different flavors. Some taste glorious, others taste slightly bitter. This one probably tasted like someone taking the last piece of cake immediately before you reached for it. The Roman officers inspected the scene. Questions were asked, theories were discussed. Nobody seemed entirely certain what had happened. Was it the famous asp? Was it poison? Was it something else? The uncertainty began almost immediately. In fact, historians have spent more than 2,000 years arguing about the details. This is one of history's oldest traditions. When nobody knows the answer, everyone becomes an expert. Meanwhile, Octavian had a practical problem. What exactly was he supposed to tell Rome? His greatest enemy was dead. Egypt was conquered. But Cleopatra would never appear in his triumph. That image, the defeated queen marching through Roman streets, had vanished forever. The crowd would still cheer. The victory would still be celebrated. Yet the most dramatic scene was gone. Somewhere behind his carefully controlled public expression, Octavian must have felt a certain irritation. Because despite losing her kingdom, her army, her allies, and ultimately her life, Cleopatra had still managed to deny him the ending he wanted. And for a ruler who would soon command the entire Roman world, that was a surprisingly personal defeat. The moment Cleopatra died, something fascinating happened. History immediately began rewriting her, not intentionally, Not maliciously, just the normal way history tends to operate whenever famous people are involved. The real Cleopatra had been a politician, strategist, diplomat, linguist, administrator, naval commander, economist, and queen. The legendary Cleopatra was rapidly becoming something else entirely. A romantic symbol, a tragic heroine. A woman whose entire life would eventually be reduced to a love story. This would have probably annoyed her. Quite a lot. After all, Cleopatra had spent decades governing a kingdom. She spoke multiple languages. She managed Egypt's economy. She negotiated with foreign powers. She survived political crises that would have destroyed most rulers. Yet future generations would often summarize her career as, "She met two Roman men." History can be wonderfully unfair. Meanwhile, Octavian understood that controlling the story was almost as important as winning the war. The Roman leader was a master of public relations long before the phrase existed. He wanted Romans to remember Cleopatra in a very specific way. Not as a capable ruler, not as a skilled political rival. Certainly not as someone who had nearly reshaped the Roman world. Instead, she would be portrayed as an exotic foreign queen who had corrupted Antony and distracted him from his duties. This version of events happened to make Octavian look much better. A remarkable coincidence. Poets joined in. Writers joined in. Artists joined in. Before long, the real events were becoming buried beneath layers of storytelling. Even the famous snake became larger than life. The asp turned into one of history's most recognizable symbols, despite the fact that nobody could fully agree whether it had even been there. Reality slowly disappeared. Legend took its place. The funny part is that the actual story was already dramatic enough. There was no need for embellishment. A queen trapped by a Roman conqueror, a false death rumour, a wounded Antony being hauled through a window, treasure-filled tombs, political intrigue, last-minute negotiations, a future emperor desperately trying to keep his most valuable prisoner alive. The real story already sounded unbelievable, yet humanity looked at all that and collectively decided, you know what this needs? More drama. And so the legend grew. For centuries, people would remember Cleopatra as one of history's great tragic figures. But very few would remember the confusion, misunderstandings, awkward moments, and spectacular communication failures that filled her final weeks. Which is a shame, because sometimes history becomes most interesting precisely when its heroes stop behaving like legends and start behaving like human beings. And Cleopatra's final days were filled with exactly that kind of humanity. The funniest part of Cleopatra's final days is not the snake. It is not the treasure. It is not even Mark Antony being hauled through a window like an oversized sack of grain. The funniest part is that almost everyone involved spent those final weeks misunderstanding what was actually happening. Consider the cast of characters. Octavian believed he could control Cleopatra. Cleopatra believed she might still find a way to control events. Antony believed Cleopatra was dead. Cleopatra was very much alive. Messengers believed they were sharing useful information. They were not. Roman officers believed they were preventing surprises. They were in fact being surprised repeatedly. For a story that later became one of history's greatest tragedies, an astonishing amount of it was powered by confusion. Take Antony, for example. Here was one of the most accomplished military commanders of his age. He had fought alongside Julius Caesar. He had commanded massive armies. He had governed huge territories. Then a rumour reached him, and instead of verifying it, questioning it, or spending 5 minutes investigating whether it was true, he simply accepted it. The fate of kingdoms was altered because somebody skipped the ancient equivalent of fact-checking. Meanwhile, Octavian spent weeks carefully planning Cleopatra's future. Every detail mattered, every possibility was considered, every risk was analysed. Yet the one thing he wanted most, a living Cleopatra in Rome, was the one thing he failed to obtain. The future emperor conquered Egypt but lost the ending. That takes talent. Then there was Cleopatra herself. History often portrays her final days as solemn and tragic. And certainly they were tragic. Her kingdom was gone. Her dynasty was ending. Her allies were dead. Yet through all of it she remained remarkably stubborn. Even when she had lost almost everything, she continued making decisions for herself. That determination frustrated nearly everyone around her, especially the Romans. Perhaps that is why her story survived. Not because she won. She didn't. Not because she defeated Octavian. She couldn't. But because she refused to let others write the final chapter while she was still alive to hold the pen. And so Egypt's last queen passed into history. The kingdom disappeared. The dynasty ended. The Roman Empire rose. Yet more than 2,000 years later, people still remember Cleopatra. Meanwhile, most of the officials, messengers, soldiers, and politicians who spent months trying to control her have been largely forgotten. History can be very sarcastic that way. In the end, Cleopatra's final days were tragic. They were dramatic. They were historic. But they were also filled with misunderstandings, awkward moments, bad timing, and enough human error to remind us that even the most famous figures in history were still, at the end of the day, people trying to figure things out as they went along. When people imagine Viking romance, they often picture a fearless warrior spotting a beautiful woman across a crowded feast hall, exchanging meaningful glances, and somehow beginning a love story worthy of a saga. The reality was usually far less dramatic and far more practical. In Viking society, marriage was not simply a personal decision. It was a family matter, a business arrangement, a political alliance, and sometimes a way to settle disputes without anyone needing to lose a finger. Love might eventually grow from a marriage, but it was rarely the first consideration. A Viking family looking for a suitable match examined many factors. Reputation mattered greatly. A family known for honesty, wealth, and strong connections attracted more interest than one known for feuds, debts, or suspicious livestock disappearances. Marriage linked entire households together, meaning every relative became part of the equation. For young men, proving their worth was important. A potential husband needed to show he could support a household. Owning land was ideal. Having livestock helped. Demonstrating skill as a trader, craftsman, sailor, or warrior also increased his chances. Nobody wanted their daughter marrying a man whose greatest achievement was surviving 3 consecutive drinking contests. Young women were valued for far more than beauty. Families looked for qualities that would contribute to a successful household. A capable woman managed food supplies, supervised workers, produced textiles, and helped maintain the family's wealth. Running a Viking farm was not a small responsibility. It required intelligence, organisation, and enough patience to deal with both livestock and relatives. Despite the strong influence of families, Norse women often enjoyed more rights than many women elsewhere in medieval Europe. While parents played an important role in arranging matches, women were not always passive participants. Saga literature contains numerous examples of women expressing opinions about potential husbands, rejecting unsuitable candidates, and occasionally influencing decisions in surprisingly direct ways. Courtship itself could happen in many settings. Seasonal festivals, community gatherings, markets, religious celebrations, and family feasts all provided opportunities for young people to meet. These events allowed families to observe potential matches while pretending they were simply enjoying the entertainment. Because beneath the music, storytelling, and ale, important calculations were taking place. Every conversation, every introduction, and every visit could be the beginning of negotiations that would unite families, strengthen alliances, and shape the future of entire households. For Vikings, choosing a partner was rarely left to chance. After all, love was wonderful. Productive farmland, useful relatives, and a stable future were even better. Long before a Viking man or woman began searching for a spouse, they spent years preparing for the responsibilities that marriage would bring. In Norse society, adulthood was not marked by a birthday cake, an awkward family dinner, or a driver's license. It was measured by competence. Could you contribute to the household? Could you work? Could you survive? If the answer was yes, marriage became a realistic possibility. From childhood, boys and girls learned the skills expected of them as future adults. Young boys accompanied their fathers and older relatives into fields, forests, workshops, and ships. They learned how to farm difficult land, repair tools, handle livestock, navigate coastal waters, and defend themselves if necessary. Life in Scandinavia could be harsh, and there was little room for someone who preferred sleeping late while everyone else worked. Many boys also dreamed of earning wealth through trade, exploration, or raiding. Success could dramatically improve their marriage prospects. Returning home with silver, valuable goods, or a growing reputation was often more attractive than simply possessing a charming smile. Girls underwent equally demanding preparation. They learned spinning, weaving, cooking, food preservation, brewing, and household management. These tasks may sound ordinary today, but in Viking society they were critical for survival. A skilled woman could significantly increase a family's prosperity. Producing cloth alone was a massive undertaking that required knowledge, patience, and countless hours of labour. As girls matured, they often assumed greater responsibilities within the household. They managed supplies, supervised younger children, and learned how to organise daily operations. Running a successful Viking farm was not unlike managing a small business, except the business occasionally involved sheep escaping during snowstorms. By their teenage years, both young men and women were already being observed by their communities. Reputation mattered enormously. Hard work, good behaviour, and reliability enhanced future marriage opportunities. Laziness, recklessness, or a habit of starting unnecessary feuds could quickly damage one's prospects. Families paid close attention to these qualities. They wanted future sons-in-law and daughters-in-law who could strengthen the household rather than create problems. Marriage was expected to last for years and involve cooperation between entire families. Choosing poorly could lead to disputes, financial hardship, or endless arguments during family gatherings. As a result, courtship did not begin with romantic gestures alone. It began with years of preparation. Every skill learned, every responsibility accepted, and every reputation earned helped shape a young Viking's future. By the time marriage negotiations eventually started, families already knew a great deal about the people involved. In small communities, everyone's strengths, weaknesses, and embarrassing childhood mistakes were usually common knowledge. Once a young man and woman appeared suitable for marriage, the process moved beyond simple interest and entered a stage that Vikings took very seriously: negotiation. This was the point where families became heavily involved. While the future couple certainly mattered, the marriage itself was viewed as an agreement between households. Parents, relatives, and sometimes influential community members gathered to discuss terms that would affect everyone involved. A Viking marriage was not simply announced. It was arranged through careful discussion and formal agreements. These negotiations could last weeks or even months, depending on the families, their wealth, and the complexity of the situation. One of the most important topics was property. The groom's family typically provided a bride price, known as the munder. This payment was given to the bride's family and served as proof that the groom could support a household. It demonstrated commitment and financial stability. A man who could not provide a respectable munder might struggle to convince a family that he was ready for marriage. At the same time, the bride usually brought property into the marriage as well. This dowry could include livestock, clothing, household goods, land rights, silver, or other valuable possessions. Far from being a symbolic gift, the dowry often represented a significant contribution to the new household's future prosperity. The discussions were not purely financial. Families also considered reputation, alliances, and long-term benefits. Marrying into a respected family could provide protection, trade opportunities, and valuable connections. In a world where local politics could be complicated and feuds could last generations, good alliances were often worth their weight in silver. Naturally, not every negotiation went smoothly. Some families demanded more than others. Wealthy households could be extremely selective. Proud fathers occasionally valued their daughters at prices that made nearby farmers question whether they were arranging a marriage or purchasing an entire fleet of ships. The Icelandic sagas preserve many stories of difficult negotiations, stubborn relatives, and heated discussions. Some meetings ended successfully. Others collapsed when neither side was willing to compromise. Yet despite occasional disagreements, these negotiations served an important purpose. They helped ensure that both families entered the marriage with clear expectations and mutual obligations. By the time an agreement was finally reached, everyone knew their responsibilities. Property had been discussed, alliances had been formed, and preparations could begin. Only then could the couple move closer to the wedding itself, a celebration that would involve feasting, drinking, gifts, and enough food to remind everyone that Viking hospitality was almost as important as Viking warfare. Once families had reached an agreement, the future bride and groom were no longer complete strangers, linked only by negotiations. Now came the period of courtship, when the relationship itself began to develop. Modern dating often focuses on private conversations, shared hobbies, and long walks designed to determine compatibility. Viking courtship was somewhat different. Communities were small, privacy was rare, and there was usually a relative nearby who considered everyone else's business their personal hobby. Most young people met at gatherings where families and neighbours came together. Seasonal festivals, harvest celebrations, religious ceremonies, local assemblies and trading markets all created opportunities for interaction. These events were among the few occasions when large numbers of people gathered in one place, making them ideal for meeting potential partners. Feasts played a particularly important role. During these celebrations, young men and women could talk, observe one another, and demonstrate their skills. A man might gain attention through storytelling, poetry, athletic contests, or displays of confidence. A woman could showcase intelligence, household skills, conversation, and social grace. Contrary to modern stereotypes, Vikings valued wit almost as much as physical strength. The Norse admired cleverness. A person who could speak well, negotiate effectively, or compose a memorable verse often earned considerable respect. Being able to swing an axe was useful. Being able to avoid needing the axe in the first place was sometimes even better. Gift-giving also became part of courtship. Small gifts helped demonstrate affection and commitment. Jewellery, finely crafted items, clothing, or personal possessions might be exchanged between the couple. Such gifts carried symbolic meaning and often served as visible reminders of the growing relationship. Saga literature contains numerous examples of romance developing during this stage. Some stories describe genuine affection and mutual admiration. Others involve misunderstandings, jealous rivals, stubborn parents, and enough family drama to keep a saga writer employed for years. Women frequently had more influence over courtship than outsiders sometimes assume. A determined woman could encourage a match, discourage an unwanted suitor, or persuade relatives to reconsider their plans. While family approval remained important, personal feelings were not entirely ignored. Of course, not every courtship ended happily. Illness, changing political circumstances, financial difficulties, or family disputes could still disrupt marriage plans. Life in the Viking Age offered no guarantees. But when courtship progressed successfully, excitement began to build throughout both households. Negotiations were complete, gifts had been exchanged, and preparations were underway. The next step was the wedding itself, a celebration so important that guests might travel long distances simply for the chance to eat, drink, and witness the creation of a new family. After months of preparation, negotiations, and courtship, the wedding day finally arrived. For Viking families, this was not a quiet ceremony attended by a handful of relatives. It was one of the most important celebrations a community could hold, combining legal agreements, family alliances, religious traditions, and enough food and drink to test the limits of human judgment. Weddings were often scheduled during times when travel was easier and food supplies were plentiful. Harvest season was particularly popular. Families wanted guests arriving in good spirits rather than stumbling through snowstorms while questioning every decision that had brought them there. Preparations could take weeks. Large quantities of ale and mead had to be brewed. Animals were selected for slaughter. Bread was baked, fish prepared, and seating arranged. Hospitality was a serious matter in Viking society. A family that hosted a poor wedding feast risked becoming the subject of gossip for years. Guests often travelled considerable distances to attend. Relatives, neighbours, friends, and important allies gathered to witness the union. Their presence served an important purpose. Marriage was not simply a private event, it was a public agreement recognised by the community. The ceremony itself varied across the Viking world, but certain elements appeared frequently. Oaths were exchanged, gifts were presented, and legal agreements were confirmed before witnesses. These public declarations helped ensure that everyone understood the rights and obligations created by the marriage. The bride was often accompanied by female relatives who assisted with preparations. Special clothing, jewellery, and family heirlooms might be worn during the ceremony. The groom likewise dressed in his finest attire. For one day, even the man who usually smelled faintly of livestock and seawater attempted to appear respectable. Feasting followed. Long tables filled with roasted meats, fish, bread, cheese, and ale became the centre of the celebration. Storytelling, music, games, and drinking occupied much of the gathering. Skalds recited poetry. Guests exchanged news and formed new connections. The wedding feast strengthened social bonds just as much as it celebrated the couple. One tradition may even be responsible for the modern term honeymoon. Newly married couples were sometimes expected to drink mead for a month after the wedding. Whether this always improved marital harmony remains unknown, though it probably made difficult relatives slightly easier to tolerate. The festivities could continue for several days, but beneath the laughter, drinking, and celebration, something significant had occurred. Two individuals had become husband and wife. More importantly, in Viking eyes, two families had become permanently connected. The feast marked not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new household that would face the challenges of Viking life together. Once the wedding feast ended, and the last guest finally stopped asking for one more cup of ale, reality returned. The married couple now faced the challenge that every Viking family eventually encountered: daily life. While Viking marriages were built on legal agreements and family alliances, they also depended on cooperation. Survival in the Norse world required constant work, and a successful household functioned best when both husband and wife fulfilled important responsibilities. The husband was generally considered the head of the household in legal and political matters. He represented the family at assemblies, managed trade agreements, oversaw farming operations, and provided protection when necessary. Whether working fields, sailing to distant markets, or joining military expeditions, his actions directly affected the family's prosperity. However, this did not mean the wife held a minor role. In fact, Viking women often exercised considerable authority within the home. The wife managed household affairs, supervised food production, controlled storage supplies, directed servants or workers if the family had them, and oversaw textile production. These responsibilities were essential. A poorly managed household could struggle through winter regardless of how successful the husband might be elsewhere. One powerful symbol of a married woman's authority was the set of household keys she often carried. These keys represented control over storage rooms, valuables, food supplies, and important resources. In many ways, they were a visible reminder that the household depended heavily on her judgment. Daily life was demanding for both spouses. A typical day might begin before sunrise and continue until darkness. Fields required attention, animals needed feeding, repairs were constant, food had to be prepared and preserved, clothing had to be produced, children required supervision. The romantic excitement of courtship quickly gave way to practical concerns, such as whether enough hay had been gathered for winter, or why a goat had once again escaped its enclosure. Many husbands spent extended periods away from home. Trading voyages, fishing expeditions, seasonal travel, or military campaigns could keep men absent for weeks or months. During these times, wives often managed the household independently. Saga accounts frequently describe women making important decisions, protecting family property, and maintaining order while their husbands were away. This level of responsibility earned respect. The strongest Viking marriages were often partnerships built on mutual dependence. Each spouse possessed skills the other needed. Neither could easily succeed alone. The sagas celebrate warriors, explorers, and kings. But behind many of those stories stood capable husbands and wives, working together to maintain their households. Because while conquering distant shores might earn fame, keeping a Viking farm running through a Scandinavian winter was its own kind of achievement. Despite popular images of Vikings as relentless warriors, their marriages contained many of the same emotions found in relationships throughout history. There was affection, loyalty, jealousy, frustration, compromise, and occasionally the strong desire to throw something at a spouse who had made a particularly foolish decision. Marriage was expected to create stability, but that did not mean every relationship was harmonious. Living in close quarters while managing a demanding household created plenty of opportunities for disagreement. Financial difficulties, family feuds, inheritance disputes, and long periods of separation could place enormous strain on a marriage. A husband returning from months at sea might find that life at home had changed considerably. A wife managing the household alone might not appreciate being told how things should have been done by someone who had spent the past season elsewhere. The Icelandic sagas contain countless examples of marital conflict. Some disputes were minor and humorous, Others became serious enough to involve entire families. Harsh words could damage reputations. Broken promises could create lasting resentment. In extreme cases, disagreements between spouses could contribute to larger feuds involving relatives and neighbours. Yet Viking society also recognised something unusual for the medieval world: divorce. Unlike many societies of the time, Norse women often possessed the legal right to end a marriage under certain circumstances. Divorce was not viewed as ideal, but it was accepted as a legitimate solution when a relationship failed. The process itself was surprisingly formal. A woman seeking divorce generally had to declare her intention before witnesses. The exact procedures varied across regions, but public declarations were important because they established the legal end of the marriage. Property rights, dowries, and financial obligations then had to be settled according to local customs and laws. Men could also initiate divorce under certain conditions. Common reasons included abandonment, abuse, failure to provide support, repeated violence, or behaviour considered dishonourable. The fact that these legal options existed suggests that Viking marriage was viewed as a contract carrying responsibilities for both parties. This legal flexibility gave women a degree of protection that was uncommon in many parts of medieval Europe. A wife was not necessarily trapped forever in an unsuccessful marriage. Of course, divorce was rarely simple. Families often became involved, property had to be divided, and community opinions could complicate matters. Nobody enjoyed becoming the main topic of discussion at every feast and gathering for the next several months. Still, the existence of divorce reveals an important truth about Viking marriage. It was not simply about creating an alliance. It was also about maintaining a functioning partnership. And when that partnership completely broke down, Norse law recognised that sometimes the best solution was for both people to go their separate ways. For Viking couples, marriage was not viewed as the final goal. It was the beginning of something much larger. Families expected a marriage to produce children, strengthen the household, and ensure that property, traditions, and family honour continued into the next generation. Children were enormously important in Norse society. Life expectancy was uncertain, disease was common, and daily life carried many risks. Every family understood that the future depended on raising capable sons and daughters who could eventually take over responsibilities within the household. A successful marriage was often measured not only by the happiness of the couple, but by the strength of the family they created together. The birth of a child was therefore a significant event. Relatives gathered to celebrate, gifts were exchanged, and hopes for the child's future began almost immediately. Parents looked at newborns and imagined future farmers, traders, craftsmen, explorers, or household leaders. The baby, meanwhile, was mostly concerned with sleeping and creating problems at inconvenient hours. Naming ceremonies carried special importance. Many children were named after respected ancestors, helping preserve family memory across generations. Names connected the living to the dead, reinforcing the idea that each generation formed part of a larger family story. Carrying the name of a successful grandparent brought honour, but it also created expectations. No pressure, of course, just generations of family reputation resting on your tiny shoulders. Both parents played important roles in raising children. Fathers taught practical skills, family history, and legal obligations. Sons often learned farming, trading, hunting, sailing, or warfare from male relatives. Mothers taught daughters household management, textile production, food preparation, and the countless skills necessary to run a successful home. However, these divisions were not always rigid. In smaller households, everyone learned a little of everything. As children grew, they became active contributors to the family economy. Young boys and girls helped care for animals, gather resources, assist with chores, and support daily operations. Childhood existed, but it was generally shorter than what many people experience today. Responsibility arrived early. Family expectations extended beyond immediate survival. Parents hoped their children would strengthen the family's reputation, create new alliances through marriage, and protect inherited property. Every successful child increased the family's standing within the community. For Viking couples, this was the ultimate purpose of marriage. Not merely romance or companionship, but continuity. Through children, families preserved their names, their wealth, their traditions, and their place in society. In a world where fame could be fleeting and fortunes could disappear, raising the next generation was perhaps the most important legacy anyone could leave behind. By the time we reach the end of the story, one thing becomes clear. Viking marriage was far more complex than the popular image often presented in movies and television. It was not simply a tale of fierce warriors carrying away brides, while dramatic music played in the background. Nor was it purely a cold business arrangement with no room for personal feelings. The reality existed somewhere between those extremes. Marriage sat at the very centre of Viking society. It connected families, protected property, created alliances, produced heirs, and helped communities remain stable in an often unpredictable world. Every major aspect of life, wealth, reputation, inheritance, politics, and survival, could be influenced by whom a person married. For that reason, Vikings approached marriage with remarkable seriousness. Long before he became a general, a president, or the face staring back from a dollar bill, George Washington was simply a young man searching for a place in the world. He was born in 1732 in colonial Virginia into a family that was respectable, but not among the richest members of the colony's elite. His father, Augustine Washington, owned land and enjoyed a comfortable position. But when George was only 11 years old, that stability suddenly changed. Augustine died, leaving the family without the guidance and opportunities that a wealthy father could provide. Unlike many young gentlemen of Virginia's highest class, George never attended college in England. He never received the expensive formal education that many future leaders enjoyed. Instead, he faced a reality that would have been familiar to countless young men throughout history. If he wanted success, he would have to earn it himself. Fortunately, George possessed something that could not be inherited: ambition. Even as a teenager, Washington displayed an unusual determination to improve his position. He carefully studied books on manners, copied rules of behaviour into notebooks, and observed how successful men conducted themselves. He understood that reputation mattered. In colonial Virginia, connections opened doors, but personal discipline helped keep them open. One of the most important influences in his young life was his older half-brother Lawrence Washington. Lawrence had served in the British military and moved among Virginia's wealthiest families. Through Lawrence, young George gained access to influential people who would help shape his future. Among them was Thomas Fairfax, a powerful landowner whose vast estates stretched toward the western frontier. To many colonists, the frontier represented uncertainty. Dense forests covered enormous areas, rivers cut through unexplored valleys, mountains formed barriers between settled communities and the wilderness beyond. The region was beautiful, dangerous, and largely unmapped. To George Washington, it represented opportunity. While other young men dreamed of inheriting wealth, Washington saw potential in the lands beyond the settled colonies. The frontier offered something increasingly rare in the crowded eastern regions: room to grow. The challenge, of course, was that these lands were not empty. Native nations had lived there for generations, Wild animals roamed the forests. Travel was difficult, and survival often depended on preparation and luck. Yet the risks only seemed to increase Washington's interest. As he approached his mid-teens, an opportunity appeared that would change the course of his life. It would send him deep into the wilderness, teach him valuable skills, and introduce him to a world far harsher than the comfortable plantations of eastern Virginia. The young man who entered that wilderness was still searching for his future. The man who emerged would begin building one. The opportunity that changed George Washington's life did not arrive in the form of a military commission, a political office, or a great inheritance. It arrived with a compass, a measuring chain, and a great deal of walking. In 1748, at just 16 years old, Washington joined a surveying expedition into Virginia's western lands. The journey was organised through the influence of Thomas Fairfax, whose vast estate stretched across the frontier. Fairfax needed reliable surveyors to map and divide his lands, and the young George quickly caught his attention. For Washington, this was more than a job. It was a chance to step into a world that few young Virginians ever experienced firsthand. Surveying was one of the most important professions in colonial America. Land was wealth, and wealth depended on knowing exactly where one piece of land ended and another began. Surveyors measured forests, rivers, valleys, and mountains, creating maps that transformed wilderness into property. The work demanded precision. A small mistake could lead to disputes worth fortunes. Surveyors carried chains for measuring distance, compasses for determining direction, and notebooks filled with calculations. Every tree, stream, ridge, and boundary had to be carefully recorded. For a teenager, it was demanding work. Days often began before sunrise and ended after dark. Washington and his companions travelled through rough terrain, crossed icy rivers, climbed steep hills, and endured weather that seemed personally offended by their presence. One early expedition took him into the Shenandoah Valley, a region of remarkable beauty. Dense forests stretched across the landscape. Mountain ranges dominated the horizon. Rivers wound through fertile valleys that many colonists viewed as the future of Virginia. Washington was fascinated. His journals reveal a young man carefully observing everything around him. He noted the quality of land, the size of forests, and the possibilities for future settlement. While others saw wilderness, Washington increasingly saw opportunity. The frontier also exposed him to a wider range of people than he had encountered at home. He met settlers carving farms from forests, hunters living far from established communities, and experienced frontiersmen who possessed skills that no classroom could teach. Many lived under difficult conditions that would have shocked wealthy Virginians back east. The experience matured him quickly. Surveying required responsibility, self-discipline, and independence. There was little room for carelessness when mistakes could cost money or place travellers in danger. Most importantly, Washington began earning his own income. For the first time, he was building a career through his own efforts rather than relying on family connections alone. The wilderness was becoming his classroom, and every mile travelled taught lessons that would prove valuable long after the surveying work ended. The frontier was beginning to shape the future leader, even if nobody yet realised it. As Washington gained experience as a surveyor, his assignments carried him farther from the settled regions of Virginia and deeper into the frontier. The comfortable plantations and organised towns of the eastern colonies gradually disappeared behind him, replaced by forests that seemed to stretch forever. This was not wilderness in the modern sense, complete with marked trails and helpful maps. Much of the land Washington explored was unfamiliar to European settlers. Dense woods covered hills and valleys. Rivers often served as highways, barriers, and navigational guides all at once. Travellers could spend days without encountering a single permanent settlement. For a young man barely out of childhood, the experience was both exciting and intimidating. Washington and his companions frequently travelled on horseback through difficult terrain. Paths could vanish without warning. Streams that appeared manageable in the morning could become dangerous obstacles after heavy rain. A simple journey often required careful planning and considerable patience. The weather rarely cooperated. Spring brought mud that seemed determined to swallow boots whole. Summer brought heat, insects, and exhausting days under the sun. Winter introduced freezing temperatures and snow-covered landscapes that transformed ordinary travel into a test of endurance. Washington recorded many of these experiences in his journals. One expedition forced him to sleep outdoors in conditions that were far from comfortable. Instead of a warm bed, he found himself lying on the ground beneath the open sky. Instead of a hearty dinner, meals were often whatever could be carried or obtained along the journey. The frontier was not interested in anyone's social status. Out there, a wealthy landowner and a poor labourer both became equally wet during a storm. Yet Washington seemed to thrive on the challenge. The wilderness demanded self-reliance. Problems had to be solved immediately because there was rarely anyone nearby to help. If equipment broke, it had to be repaired. If supplies ran low, solutions had to be found. Complaining accomplished very little, though it probably remained popular. The frontier also taught him observation. A successful surveyor needed to notice everything: the shape of a hill, the direction of a river, the quality of soil, and the location of natural landmarks all mattered. Over time, Washington developed an eye for details that others might overlook. Perhaps most importantly, he learned confidence. Every successful expedition proved that he could handle difficulties, make decisions, and endure hardship. The timid teenager who had first entered the wilderness was gradually disappearing. In his place emerged a young man becoming comfortable with uncertainty, challenge, and risk. Those qualities would serve him well, because the frontier still had many lessons left to teach, and some of them would be far more dangerous than sleeping under the stars. The deeper George Washington travelled into the frontier, the more he discovered that surveying was only part of the job. The wilderness did not care how accurately he measured a field or how neatly he drew a map. Before he could calculate property lines, he first had to survive the journey itself. By the late 1740s and early 1750s, Washington was spending long periods in regions where roads barely existed. Travel often meant following narrow trails, crossing rivers on horseback, and navigating forests that seemed endless. Every expedition became a lesson in endurance. One of the first things the young surveyor learned was how quickly conditions could change. A calm river in the morning might become dangerous after heavy rain. A clear trail could vanish beneath fallen trees. A pleasant day could end with freezing temperatures. On the frontier, nature constantly reminded travellers that making plans and controlling events were not necessarily the same thing. Washington learned to pack carefully and waste nothing. Food had to last for long journeys. Equipment had to be maintained. A broken tool could create serious problems when the nearest settlement was several days away. Every item carried into the wilderness served a purpose. He also learned the value of adaptability. When campsites proved unsuitable, new ones had to be found. When weather ruined plans, routes had to change. Frontier travel rewarded flexibility and punished stubbornness. Fortunately, Washington possessed plenty of determination. Unfortunately, nature often possessed more. Sleeping arrangements were rarely comfortable. Many nights were spent outdoors with little protection from rain, cold, or insects. Blankets became precious possessions. A dry campsite felt like luxury. A warm meal could improve morale far more effectively than any inspiring speech. The young Virginian also learned to read the landscape. Experienced frontiersmen taught him how rivers flowed through valleys where game animals could be found, and how weather patterns affected travel. Knowledge of terrain often meant the difference between a successful expedition and a miserable one. The frontier demanded physical toughness as well. Washington rode long distances, walked difficult terrain, and endured conditions that would have convinced many gentlemen to return home immediately. Instead, each hardship seemed to strengthen his confidence. Over time, he developed a reputation for resilience. People noticed that the young surveyor could handle discomfort without complaint and continue working when conditions became difficult. These qualities earned respect among experienced frontiersmen who were not easily impressed. Without realizing it, Washington was receiving an education that no school could provide. The frontier was teaching patience, discipline, endurance, and leadership. Years later, when he faced military campaigns, harsh winters, and impossible odds, many of the skills that helped him endure would trace back to these early days spent surviving on the edge of Britain's American empire. As George Washington continued exploring the frontier, he encountered something that maps and surveying instruments could never fully explain. The people who had lived on these lands long before British colonists arrived. To many settlers in Virginia, the western frontier appeared to be an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. The reality was far more complicated. The forests, rivers, and valleys Washington travelled through were part of a vast network of Native American territories, trade routes, hunting grounds, and communities. For a young surveyor, these encounters provided an education unlike anything he could have received at home. Washington met members of various native nations during his journeys. Some interactions were brief and peaceful. Others required careful diplomacy and mutual caution. On the frontier, misunderstandings could have serious consequences, and both settlers and native communities understood this well. The young Virginian quickly learned that survival in the wilderness often depended on knowledge that native peoples had developed over countless generations. They understood the landscape in ways few European settlers could match. They knew the best travel routes through forests, the locations of important rivers and crossings, the habits of local wildlife, and the changing patterns of the seasons. What appeared to Washington as a vast and untamed wilderness was, to many native communities, a familiar homeland filled with meaning and history. These encounters challenged some of the assumptions common among colonial settlers. Washington discovered that the frontier was not simply a line separating civilization from wilderness. It was a complex meeting ground where different cultures, interests, and ambitions constantly interacted. At the same time, tensions were growing. British colonists continued pushing westward in search of land and opportunity. Native nations sought to protect territories that were essential to their survival. French traders and officials were also expanding their influence in the region. The frontier was becoming increasingly crowded, and competition for land was intensifying. Washington may not have fully understood it yet, but he was witnessing the early stages of conflicts that would eventually reshape North America. The young surveyor paid close attention to these developments. He listened to conversations about alliances, trade, territory, and power. He observed how important negotiation could be when different groups pursued competing goals. Years later, these experiences would prove invaluable. As a military officer and political leader, Washington would frequently deal with native nations, frontier settlers, and rival empires. The lessons began here, deep in the wilderness, where he first encountered the complicated human landscape beyond Virginia's settled borders. The frontier was no longer simply teaching him how to survive nature. It was teaching him how to navigate people, interests, and conflicts, skills that would shape the rest of his life. By the time George Washington reached his early 20s, he was no longer simply a surveyor exploring wilderness. He had become someone the colonial government believed could be trusted with responsibility. That trust would soon place him in the middle of a growing international crisis. Throughout the early 1750s, tensions between Britain and France were increasing across North America. Both empires claimed enormous stretches of territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the Ohio country. Maps in London and Paris showed ownership of these lands, but on the ground the situation was far less clear. French soldiers were building forts. British colonists were moving west. Native nations were carefully weighing alliances. And everyone understood that conflict might not be far away. In 1753, Virginia's governor selected the 21-year-old Washington for an important assignment. His mission was straightforward in theory, but potentially dangerous in practice. He was ordered to travel deep into contested territory and deliver a message demanding that French forces leave lands claimed by Britain. For a young man with limited military experience, it was a remarkable opportunity. It was also a remarkable risk. Washington's journey took him hundreds of miles through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. Accompanied by guides, interpreters, and a small group of companions, he travelled through forests, crossed rivers, and visited native leaders whose support both empires desperately wanted. The trip tested every skill he had learned during his years on the frontier. His surveying experience helped him navigate unfamiliar landscapes. His knowledge of wilderness travel allowed him to endure harsh conditions. His encounters with different cultures helped him communicate with people whose interests did not always align with Britain's. Eventually, Washington reached the French commanders stationed in the region. The meeting was polite but tense. The French officers listened to his message, treated him respectfully, and then essentially informed him that they had no intention of leaving. Empires rarely abandon territory simply because a young messenger asks nicely. Washington now faced the challenge of returning home with this unwelcome news. The journey back proved even more dangerous than the trip out. Winter weather struck the frontier with full force. Rivers froze. Snow covered the landscape. At one point, Washington and a companion were forced to abandon horses and continue on foot through difficult conditions. The experience nearly cost him his life, yet he persevered, eventually returning to Virginia with valuable information about French positions and intentions. The mission transformed his reputation. For the first time, Washington attracted attention beyond Virginia's frontier communities. He had completed a difficult assignment under dangerous circumstances. More importantly, he had taken his first steps onto a much larger stage, one where surveying lines on maps would soon give way to drawing battle lines across a continent. Washington returned from his mission to the Ohio country with valuable information, but the report he delivered carried troubling news. The French were staying. They had no intention of abandoning their forts, no intention of surrendering their claims, and no intention of making Britain's life any easier on the frontier. For Virginia's leaders, this was unacceptable. For George Washington, it meant a new opportunity. In early 1754, he received a military promotion and was sent back toward the Ohio country, this time not as a messenger, but as an officer. At only 22 years old, he suddenly found himself responsible for soldiers, supplies, and decisions that could have serious consequences. The ambitious young Virginian was thrilled. For years he had admired military service. His older half-brother Lawrence had served in the British military and inspired George's fascination with uniforms, discipline, and honour. Now Washington finally had a chance to prove himself, The problem was that military command turned out to be considerably more complicated than surveying land. A surveyor mostly argued with rivers, mountains, and bad weather. An officer had to manage people. Washington quickly discovered that soldiers could be difficult. Supplies often arrived late. Equipment was frequently inadequate. Orders were sometimes unclear. Men complained, argued, and occasionally ignored instructions altogether. It was an education in leadership. As he advanced into the frontier, Washington worked alongside native allies and colonial troops while trying to monitor French movements. Reports arrived constantly. Rumours spread quickly. Nobody knew exactly where the next confrontation might occur. Then came the incident that would change everything. In May 1754, Washington and his men encountered a small French detachment near a place called Jumonville Glen. What exactly happened remains debated by historians even today. The encounter quickly turned violent, resulting in several French casualties, including the French officer Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. For Washington, the consequences were immediate. A local frontier dispute suddenly became something much larger. The French viewed the event as an attack. British authorities defended their position. News spread across North America and eventually reached Europe. The young officer probably did not realize it at the time, but his actions had helped ignite a conflict that would grow into the French and Indian War, itself part of the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. It was a remarkable development. A young man who only a few years earlier had been measuring forests and drawing maps was now involved in events that would shape the future of empires. Washington had wanted military glory. Instead, he received something far more valuable: experience. The lessons, however, were only beginning, and the next one would arrive at a hastily constructed frontier fort called Fort Necessity. If George Washington imagined that military life would be a steady climb toward glory, the summer of 1754 delivered a very different lesson. After the clash at Jumonville Glen, Washington understood that French forces would likely respond. His small force was deep in contested territory, far from major British settlements and surrounded by uncertainty. He needed a defensive position, and he needed one quickly. The result was Fort Necessity. The name alone should have been a warning. Military commanders generally prefer forts named things like Victory, Strength, or Triumph. A fort named Necessity sounds like something built, because there were no better options available, which, unfortunately, was exactly the case. Washington selected a meadow known as Great Meadows and ordered his men to construct a small wooden fortification. The location seemed practical at first. It offered open ground and access to water. Yet it also had serious weaknesses that would soon become painfully obvious. The surrounding forests and higher ground overlooked the fort. To experienced military officers, this was less than ideal. To the French, it was an opportunity. As Washington worked to strengthen his position, French forces moved towards him. They greatly outnumbered his men and included experienced soldiers who were familiar with frontier warfare. Then, on a rainy day in July, the attack came. French and native forces surrounded Fort Necessity and opened fire from the nearby woods. Rain poured down relentlessly, turning the battlefield into mud. Gunpowder became damp. Trenches filled with water. Visibility worsened. Inside the fort, Washington's men struggled to respond. The enemy enjoyed superior positions among the trees and hills. Every attempt to return fire was difficult. The fort that had seemed useful days earlier now looked increasingly vulnerable. Hour after hour, the fighting continued. Washington did his best to maintain order. He moved among his soldiers, issued commands, and tried to keep morale from collapsing. Despite his youth, he showed courage under pressure. Yet courage alone could not solve the tactical problems facing his force. Eventually, the situation became hopeless. Outnumbered, exhausted, and trapped in deteriorating conditions, Washington agreed to surrender terms offered by the French. For any ambitious young officer, it was a bitter moment. His first independent military command had ended in defeat. Yet failure can be a powerful teacher. Washington later admitted that the experience revealed weaknesses in his judgment and exposed mistakes he needed to correct. He learned that bravery did not guarantee success. Preparation mattered. Positioning mattered. Logistics mattered. Most importantly, he learned humility. Years later, when he commanded armies during the American Revolution, the lessons of fort necessity remained with him. The frontier had given George Washington another education. This one came not through success, but through failure, and sometimes those lessons last the longest. By the end of 1754, George Washington had experienced more adventure, hardship, and responsibility than many men twice his age. He had crossed untamed wilderness, survived dangerous journeys, negotiated with native leaders, delivered messages between rival empires, commanded soldiers in combat, and suffered a public military defeat. Most young officers might have viewed fort necessity as a career-ending embarrassment. Washington saw it differently. He viewed it as unfinished business. The frontier had become more than a workplace. It had become the place where his ambitions were tested. Every challenge seemed to strengthen his determination rather than weaken it. If anything, the defeat convinced him that he needed more experience, more knowledge, and greater responsibility. The Great Wall of China is one of the most famous structures ever built by human hands. Nearly everyone has heard of it. Millions have visited it. Countless books, documentaries, and legends have been devoted to it. And yet, one of the most common beliefs about the Great Wall is completely wrong. Most people imagine a single gigantic wall stretching across China from one end of the country to the other. They picture a continuous stone barrier winding endlessly over mountains and deserts, built by a single emperor for a single purpose. The reality is far more fascinating. The Great Wall is not one wall, it is many walls. Over a period of more than 2,000 years, different Chinese kingdoms and dynasties built, rebuilt, expanded, repaired, abandoned, and connected defensive barriers across northern China. Some sections were made of stone, others used brick. Many were built from packed earth. Entire stretches have disappeared back into the landscape, reclaimed by wind, rain, and time. If every known section of the Great Wall were placed together, they would stretch for thousands of miles across mountains, valleys, deserts, and grasslands. The wall does not simply cross China. In many places, it seems to weave through history itself. Its origins reach back to a time before China was unified. During the Warring States period, rival kingdoms constructed their own defensive walls to protect against neighbouring enemies. These early fortifications were often crude by later standards, but they established a tradition that would continue for centuries. Then came emperors, invasions, wars, and grand ambitions. Each generation added its own chapter to the story. Some rulers viewed the wall as a shield protecting civilization from northern raiders. Others saw it as a symbol of imperial power. Soldiers stationed along its length spent lonely years watching distant horizons for signs of danger. Merchants passed nearby on ancient trade routes. Travellers carried stories from one watchtower to the next. Over time, facts became intertwined with legends. People claimed the wall could be seen from the moon. They whispered about ghosts haunting abandoned towers. They told stories of hidden treasures, buried workers, and tragic lovers whose fates became linked forever to its stones. The Great Wall became more than a military structure. It became a symbol, a monument to ambition, endurance, sacrifice, and human determination. And perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate us today. Because the Great Wall never truly ends. Not in stone, not in memory, and certainly not in legend. If the Great Wall has a beginning in popular imagination, it usually starts with one man, Qin Shi Huang. He was the ruler who unified China in 221 BC, ending centuries of warfare between rival kingdoms and creating the first Chinese empire. To later generations, he became a figure surrounded by equal parts admiration and fear. He standardized weights, measures, coins, and writing. He built roads across the empire. He commissioned the enormous terracotta army that still guards his tomb today. And he wanted a wall. Or more accurately, he wanted many existing walls connected into something larger. The northern frontier posed a constant problem for the new empire. Nomadic groups living on the vast grasslands beyond China's borders could move quickly across enormous distances. Raids into settled regions had occurred for generations. Qin Shi Huang wanted protection. His solution was ambitious even by imperial standards. Workers, soldiers, prisoners, and labourers were sent north to connect and expand defensive fortifications that already existed. Mountains had to be crossed. Valleys had to be bridged. Earth had to be dug, carried, and compacted. The project stretched across some of the harshest terrain in Asia. Building materials varied depending on location. In some regions, workers used packed earth. In others, they used stone. Everything had to be transported without modern machinery, without engines, and without any concern for workplace safety regulations. The result was brutal. Thousands upon thousands of people laboured under difficult conditions. Heat, cold, exhaustion, disease, and accidents took a heavy toll. Ancient records describe immense human suffering, though exact numbers remain impossible to determine. Naturally, such a colossal project inspired stories. Over time, legends spread that countless workers had died during construction and were buried directly within the wall itself. The image proved powerful and memorable. Generations repeated the tale until many accepted it as fact. Archaeologists, however, have found little evidence that large numbers of workers were literally entombed inside the structure. Most likely, the story emerged because so many people died during construction that the wall became associated with sacrifice itself. In Chinese folklore, Qin Shi Huang gradually transformed into something larger than life. To some, he was a visionary who united a fractured land. To others, he was a ruthless ruler willing to spend human lives as freely as building materials. Perhaps he was both. What is certain is that his wall captured the imagination of future generations. It represented the power of an emperor, determined to reshape the world around him. Whether admired or feared, Qin Shi Huang left behind a legacy that would outlive his empire itself. And with that legacy came one of the Great Wall's oldest mysteries: how much human sacrifice can be hidden beneath a monument built to last forever. No story connected to the Great Wall is more famous in China than the legend of Mengjiangnu. Unlike tales of emperors, generals, and invading armies, this story focuses on an ordinary woman whose grief became stronger than stone itself. The legend begins during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, when labourers were being sent across the empire to work on the wall. Among them was a young man named Fan Shiliang. In most versions of the story, Fan and Meng Jiangnu meet under unusual circumstances. Sometimes he is hiding from government officials who are searching for men to force into labour. Sometimes fate simply brings them together. Whatever the details, they fall in love and marry. For a brief moment, happiness seems possible. Then reality arrives. Soon after the wedding, Imperial agents seize Fan and send him north to work on the Great Wall. Like countless other labourers, he disappears into the immense construction project. Months pass, then more months. No letters arrive, no messages return. Meng Jiangnu waits, hoping for news of her husband. Eventually, as winter approaches, she decides to make the long journey herself. She prepares warm clothing and sets out across mountains, rivers, and difficult roads. The journey is exhausting, yet her determination never wavers. When she finally reaches the wall, she asks where her husband can be found. The answer shatters her world. Fan Siliang is dead. Like many workers, he perished during construction and was buried somewhere near the wall. No one can tell her exactly where. Overcome with grief, Meng Jiangnu begins to weep. And then the legend becomes extraordinary. Her sorrow is said to be so powerful that a section of the Great Wall collapses. Stones tumble down. Earth breaks apart. Hidden beneath the ruins are the remains of her husband. The image became one of the most enduring symbols in Chinese folklore. A grieving woman bringing down an imperial monument through the force of her tears alone. Over the centuries, the story evolved. Some versions portray Qin Shi Huang himself as the villain. Others add dramatic confrontations between the emperor and Meng Jiangnu. In certain retellings, her courage and integrity expose the cruelty of imperial rule. Historians agree that the story is not a literal account of events. Yet that hardly matters. Legends survive because they express deeper truths. For generations of ordinary people, Meng Jiangnu represented loyalty, love, and resistance against injustice. While emperors built walls and armies marched across frontiers, her story reminded listeners of the human cost hidden behind great achievements. The Great Wall may symbolize power, but the legend of Meng Jiangnu reminds us that even the grandest monuments are built by human hands and remembered through human hearts. The Great Wall is impressive during the day. At night, according to countless stories told across generations, it becomes something else entirely. For centuries, travellers, soldiers, and local villagers have shared tales of strange encounters along the wall. Some speak of ghostly figures appearing in the mist. Others describe mysterious footsteps echoing through empty watchtowers. A few claim to have heard distant voices calling across the mountains when no living person was nearby. Whether these stories are true is another matter, but the fact that they exist tells us something important about the wall itself. The Great Wall passes through some of the most isolated landscapes in China. It climbs steep mountain ridges, crosses deserts, and winds through lonely valleys where silence can feel almost unnatural. In many places, a traveller can stand alone for miles without seeing another person. It is exactly the kind of setting where legends thrive. One of the most common stories involves phantom soldiers. According to local folklore, the spirits of long-dead guards still patrol abandoned sections of the wall. Travellers sometimes reported seeing figures standing atop watchtowers at dawn or dusk. From a distance, they appeared to be soldiers on duty. When approached, however, they vanished. Other legends describe mysterious lantern lights. People claim to see flickering lights moving along remote stretches of the wall late at night, as if unseen sentries were still carrying out their ancient responsibilities. Some believed these lights belonged to the spirits of soldiers who died defending the frontier and refused to abandon their posts, even in death. There are also tales of ghostly sounds. Visitors occasionally reported hearing drums, horns, or shouted commands drifting through the darkness. These noises seemed especially common during storms, when strong winds swept through towers, tunnels, and ruined fortifications. Modern explanations are far less supernatural. Wind moving through stone structures can create strange sounds. Echoes travel surprisingly far in mountain regions. Mist and poor visibility can make ordinary objects appear unsettling. Human imagination tends to become remarkably active when standing alone in a deserted watchtower after sunset. Even so, the stories persisted, partly because the wall witnessed enormous amounts of human suffering. For centuries, soldiers lived and died along its length. Workers perished during construction. Frontier battles claimed countless lives. Entire generations spent lonely years far from home, guarding distant sections of the empire. Places with such histories rarely remain free of ghost stories. Perhaps people felt that so many lives could not simply disappear without leaving something behind. Whether one believes in spirits or not, the haunted legends of the Great Wall reveal a deeper truth. The wall is not merely stone and brick, it is a place filled with memories. And sometimes, memories can feel surprisingly alive. Among all the legends surrounding the Great Wall, one has travelled farther than any other. According to the story, the Great Wall of China is the only human-made structure visible from the moon. It is a claim that has appeared in textbooks, newspapers, tourist brochures, and countless conversations. Millions of people have repeated it. Many still believe it today. There is just one small problem. It is not true. The myth is older than most people realise. Versions of it began circulating long before anyone had actually travelled into space. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Western writers marvelled at the sheer scale of the Great Wall and speculated that it might be visible from extraordinary distances. At the time, nobody could test the claim. The moon was unimaginably far away. Space travel belonged entirely to the realm of dreams and science fiction. So the story grew. After all, the Great Wall seemed like the perfect candidate. It stretched across mountains and deserts for thousands of miles. It was one of humanity's largest construction projects. If anything could be seen from space, surely it would be this. Then the space age arrived. Astronauts finally left Earth and looked back. To the disappointment of myth enthusiasts everywhere, the Great Wall proved surprisingly difficult to spot. The reason is simple. Although the wall is very long, it is relatively narrow. From orbit, length matters far less than width. A structure can stretch for hundreds of miles, but if it is only a few meters wide, it blends into the surrounding landscape. The wall also shares similar colours with the mountains, hills, and deserts through which it passes. Unlike a brightly illuminated city or a massive airport, it does not naturally stand out against its background. Several astronauts have confirmed this reality. Some reported being unable to see the wall with the naked eye. Others managed to identify certain sections only under ideal conditions, and often with the help of cameras, binoculars, or prior knowledge of where to look. As for the moon? Absolutely not. At nearly 250,000 miles away, even entire cities disappear from view. Yet the myth refuses to die. Why? Because people love symbols. The idea that humanity built something so extraordinary it can be seen from the moon captures the imagination. It transforms an impressive monument into something almost mythical. Ironically, the truth is no less remarkable. The Great Wall does not need to be visible from the moon to inspire awe. It has already accomplished something far more difficult. For over 2,000 years, it has remained visible in human memory. And that may be the most impressive feat of all. If ghost stories gave the Great Wall its supernatural reputation, treasure legends gave it mystery. For centuries, people have whispered that somewhere within the vast network of walls, towers and fortresses, lie hidden riches waiting to be discovered. Some stories speak of gold, others mention silver, precious jade, lost military supplies, or secret imperial documents concealed during times of war. Entire generations of treasure hunters have searched for evidence, convinced that the Great Wall still hides secrets beneath its ancient stones. The origins of these legends are not difficult to understand. The Great Wall was never just a wall. It functioned as a military system stretching across thousands of miles. Watchtowers, signal towers, barracks, armories, storage facilities and fortresses were scattered along its length. Vast quantities of weapons, food, equipment and supplies moved through these outposts. Whenever valuable goods are stored in large numbers, stories about hidden treasure inevitably follow. One popular legend claims that retreating soldiers occasionally buried valuables near the wall to prevent enemies from capturing them. Another tells of imperial officials secretly hiding tax revenues and emergency funds inside remote fortresses. According to some versions, maps revealing these locations were lost during wars, leaving fortunes buried and forgotten. Naturally, the treasure is always just beyond reach. Otherwise, it would simply be called found treasure. Perhaps even more intriguing are the stories of hidden tunnels and secret passages. Many people imagine vast underground networks running beneath the Great Wall, allowing soldiers to move unseen from one fortress to another. Some legends describe concealed escape routes used by generals. Others speak of secret chambers filled with weapons waiting for an emergency that never came. The reality is somewhat less dramatic. Archaeologists have discovered storage rooms, underground spaces, and defensive features associated with certain sections of the wall. Some fortresses included hidden areas designed for protection or logistics. However, there is little evidence for enormous underground tunnel systems stretching across great distances. Still, the idea remains irresistible. After all, a structure as vast as the Great Wall almost seems to demand hidden secrets. People find it difficult to believe that every mystery has already been uncovered. And in fairness, some mysteries remain. New archaeological discoveries continue to reveal forgotten sections of the wall, abandoned fortifications, and previously unknown features. Even today, researchers occasionally uncover surprises hidden by centuries of neglect and erosion. Perhaps that is why treasure legends endure, not because people expect to find mountains of gold buried beneath the wall, but because the Great Wall itself already feels like a treasure. A monument so immense, so ancient, and so complex that it still manages to keep some of its secrets hidden from the modern world. Behind every legend of ghosts, hidden treasure, and imperial ambition lies a simpler reality. For most of its history, the Great Wall was home to soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them. While emperors received credit for building the wall and generals earned fame for defending it, ordinary soldiers spent their lives serving in some of the most remote and unforgiving places in China. For many, assignment to the wall was not considered a reward. It was closer to exile. Imagine being sent hundreds of miles from your home, family and friends to a lonely watchtower perched on a windswept mountain. Winter temperatures plunged below freezing. Summer heat baked the landscape. Supplies arrived irregularly. Entertainment was limited. Very limited. When your daily excitement consists of watching the horizon and hoping nothing happens, even counting sheep can start to feel adventurous. Life along the wall revolved around routine. Soldiers patrolled sections of the fortifications, maintained defensive structures, repaired damage caused by weather, and monitored the frontier for signs of danger. Signal towers allowed messages to travel rapidly across great distances. Smoke signals during the day and fire beacons at night could warn nearby garrisons of approaching threats. In theory, it was an efficient system. In practice, much depended on the men operating it. Many soldiers stationed along the wall came from farming families. Some were volunteers. Others were assigned through military obligations. Not all were experienced warriors. A surprising number spent more time repairing walls, transporting supplies, and maintaining equipment than actually fighting. Yet danger was always present. Raids could occur with little warning. Frontier conflicts flared periodically. Harsh weather claimed lives. Disease spread through isolated garrisons. A soldier might survive years of military service only to fall victim to illness or exposure. Loneliness was perhaps the greatest enemy. Historical records and surviving writings suggest that many soldiers missed their families desperately. Some spent years without returning home. They watched seasons change from the same towers, staring across endless grasslands and wondering what was happening hundreds of miles away. Chinese poetry often captured these emotions. Poets wrote about soldiers standing guard beneath moonlit skies, listening to distant winds and longing for home. These works transformed the frontier from a military boundary into something deeply human. Because behind every section of the wall stood countless individual lives. Some became heroes, most did not. Most were ordinary men performing difficult duties in difficult places. The Great Wall survives because of their labour and sacrifice. And while legends often focus on emperors and monuments, the true story of the wall cannot be told without remembering the generations of soldiers who spent their lives guarding the edge of an empire. When most people picture the Great Wall today, they are not imagining the walls built by Qin Shi Huang or the ancient fortifications of the Warring States period. They are imagining the Great Wall of the Ming dynasty. The towering stone walls, massive watchtowers, steep mountain fortresses, and dramatic landscapes featured in photographs around the world largely date from the Ming era, which lasted from 1368 to 1644. Ironically, the Ming rulers built the wall after learning a difficult lesson. Military victories do not last forever. The Mongol Empire had once conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty. Although the Ming eventually drove the Mongols from power, they never forgot how dangerous the northern frontier could be. Mongol forces remained active beyond China's borders, capable of launching raids and threatening settlements. The Ming response was ambitious. If previous dynasties had built walls, the Ming would build stronger ones, much stronger. Over the following centuries, enormous resources were devoted to strengthening and expanding the frontier defences. Engineers redesigned vulnerable sections. Stone and brick replaced many older earthworks. Watchtowers appeared at regular intervals. Fortresses guarded strategic passes through mountain ranges. The result was one of the greatest construction projects in human history. Workers hauled materials across steep ridges, carved pathways through mountains, and erected fortifications in places that still seem almost impossible to reach today. Looking at some sections of the wall, it is difficult not to wonder who first examined a near-vertical mountain peak and confidently announced, "Yes, let's build a fortress up there." Somehow they did. The engineering achievements were extraordinary. Walls followed the contours of mountains with remarkable precision. Defensive systems allowed rapid communication between distant garrisons. Watchtowers provided observation points overlooking vast stretches of terrain. Important passes became heavily fortified military centres capable of resisting large attacks. Yet despite all this effort, the wall was never an impenetrable barrier. No wall in history has ever been perfect. Enemies occasionally found ways around it. Corruption sometimes weakened defences. Poor leadership could undermine even the strongest fortifications. In one of history's great ironies, The Ming dynasty ultimately fell not because the wall collapsed, but because political and military crises inside China weakened the empire itself. When the Manchus entered China in the 17th century, they did not smash through the Great Wall by force. A gate was opened. The lesson was clear. Walls can stop armies. They cannot always solve human problems. Still, the Ming builders achieved something remarkable. They transformed centuries of frontier defences into the iconic monument recognised around the world today. The Great Wall became more than a military structure. It became a masterpiece of engineering, determination, and human ambition carved directly into the landscape itself. For over 2,000 years, empires have risen and fallen around the Great Wall. Dynasties have disappeared. Armies have marched across its passes. Watchtowers have crumbled. Entire sections have been swallowed by deserts, forests, and time. Yet somehow, the Great Wall remains. Not merely as a physical structure, but as an idea. That may be the greatest mystery of all. Most ancient monuments eventually become relics of the past. People admire them, study them, and move on. The Great Wall is different. It continues to capture imaginations across cultures, continents, and generations. Part of its appeal comes from its sheer scale. Human beings naturally admire ambitious projects. The Great Pyramid, the Roman Colosseum, and the Great Wall all inspire the same question. How did people accomplish something so enormous with the tools available to them?